Welcome back to Generative AI and the Delivery of Legal Services. Today we're going to talk about rethinking access to justice and pro bono, touching on the current state of access to justice, key challenges in the traditional models of providing access to justice, how generative AI fits in, and finally, ethical and practical considerations. So what is the current state of access to justice? Well, there's always been this justice gap. And so the justice gap that we talk about is the gap between people's legal needs and the available resources to help them with those legal issues or needs. Mostly affects low income and marginalized communities. And also there is a high volume of civil issues, for example, eviction, debt, family law, and others that go unaddressed because of the inability to pay hourly rates for lawyers. Key statistics. Now, I'm kind of smiling because this is a statistic that comes up every single year. If you've gone to a lot of, conferences that talk about access to justice, this gets trotted out every single year. That 92% of people that have legal issues and needs do not receive adequate help. And it's just been an unfortunate fact that's persisted for years. And it's led to a lot of frustration on the part of lawyers that are trying to help, legal aid organizations and others. And we've always been hoping to have a tool in the toolbox that could help us to scale to meet that need. 74% of low-income households face at least one civil legal problem a year. Many times they don't even know that they have a legal issue. They just know that they have a problem. And then after talking to a lawyer or a legal professional, they can determine that, in fact, it is a legal problem and how to pursue it. Unfortunately, the lack of funding for a lot of legal aid organizations, as well as the lack of sufficient volunteers for pro bono, leads to many cases being turned away in the case of legal aid that are actually qualified to be covered, but they just don't have the staff to service them. One example is public defenders and their workloads. So according to a 1973 guideline, one public defender was to handle no more than 150 felony or 400 misdemeanor cases per year. But new research shows that, first of all, the limit should be much less than that. And second of all, that is not that is not the order of the day. The order of the day is that public defenders are carrying 2 to 3 times what they should be. And it's led to a situation here that is a state of legal triage, where you're just essentially dealing with the worst cases first. And that's not at all ideal or where it should be, especially when you're dealing with the high stakes of a criminal law case. COVID-19 had a very large impact on access to justice and the courts in general. Courts shut down because of COVID, and then they had very large backlogs. Remote hearings became commonplace, but it also led to this digital divide because some people had access to the internet, others did not, and then there was also some that weren't as familiar with using the internet and different applications like Zoom. Then when the eviction moratorium ended, that led obviously to a surge of eviction filings and a large amount of defenses that had to be lodged against those eviction actions. And so COVID-19, on the one hand, it greatly accelerated the legal industry's transition to digital and remote hearings and remote appearances and working remotely. But on the other hand, it also exacerbated this have and have-nots with the digital divide between those that have access to the internet and modern digital tools on the one hand, and then those that just simply did not have access to that. So some key challenges with traditional models of legal aid and pro bono are that, for example, for pro bono, the strengths of it are that you have very skilled attorneys volunteering their time. Sometimes, though, they are not skilled in the particular practice area that they'd be helping out with. For example, they might be a corporate lawyer and they're volunteering in a landlord-tenant case. And that high quality representation comes to those individual cases. So that's a strength that an ordinary person, gets to work with someone who is a very qualified and educated attorney. But, and it could also lead to systemic reforms if large firms have the time to volunteer their attorneys to help. For example, the Innocence Project is one of those, where it has literally saved people's lives by showing up evidence of factual innocence and releasing people from prison either for their lifetime or from a potential death sentence. So when we can dedicate the time, effort, and attorneys to pro bono, it could yield outsized beneficial results. Some of the challenges, though, are that it is dependent on volunteer availability, which isn't always there, especially when there's a crush of business, and billable hours that need to be met. It can't scale quickly when demand spikes. It's just subject to availability. And naturally, it's concentrated mostly in urban centers, and because that's where the large law firms are, and more rural areas are left out from pro bono opportunities for representation. The traditional approach with legal aid is that you have staff attorneys, so at least you have attorneys that are available and available on a moment's notice. Well, maybe not 9 to 5, but they also specialize in the practice areas that are needed, like housing, family law, criminal law, etc. So you don't need to retrain them or train them on these areas that they're not familiar with. But the downside is that it's funded by grants, so volunteer money as opposed to volunteer labor, and donations. Legal Services Corporation provides grant funding, and there's other sources of grants and donations, but many of them are from the government. And right now, the current climate with the administration is that this type of funding is less likely to happen. So that puts greater pressure on traditional legal aid to provide the representation that they have been providing. And the chronic underfunding, it results in a lot of eligible potential clients being turned away. So how does generative AI fit into all of this? Well, first off, a lot of legal aid and pro bono has used rule-based systems in the past. The if-then logic that we talked about, the good old-fashioned AI, as I phrased it before. And then generative AI, as we know from everything that we've learned, it learns from large data sets, can produce, generative responses, analysis, document automation, lots of great things. And it allows more of a dynamic, human-like conversation with an AI that you weren't able to capture before. So the legal aid and pro bono that was using rule-based now has access to generative AI and can provide information in a much more natural way. So use cases for one use case is the automation of tasks. It can help to draft standard pleadings and letters, summarize information, which is extremely important if you're especially dealing with a large volume of information. And it allows the attorneys to focus on stuff that would actually provide value, not just the routine tasks. It also would free up the lawyers to actually handle more cases, because if the routine stuff is being handled by AI and automation, then they can increase the volume and help more people, turn away less people. Client intake is another use case where chatbots can guide someone through basic questions, gathering the basic information to intake that new client and then get them to the next step of the attorney actually working on the case, not just gathering information. potentially could even generate preliminary drafts of forms for the lawyer. So the lawyer, when they have their first consult with the client, they already have the work 80% done because the questions have been asked, the preliminary forms have been drafted, and then the attorney is at the advantage of reviewing all of this with the client and then perfecting it so that it saves a considerable amount of time. So one case study that I want to share with you of this new future way of handling requests for legal answers, information, and resources is LIA. LIA stands for Legal Information Assistant, and it's actually a project that my company worked on with Legal Aid of North Carolina. And so I'm going to show you a little demo video of how LIA works.
Hi, my name is Leah. I was created by Legal Aid of North Carolina as an AI-powered virtual assistant. Developed in Legal Aid's Innovation Lab in collaboration with LawDroid, I am designed to provide efficient and high-quality legal information to underserved communities. I do not provide legal advice, but I can give you helpful information and resources. Let's see how this actually works. You can start with the suggestions in the blue tab or type your answer in the chat box, such as, what are my rights as a tenant? Be clear and specific. The more details you give, the better I can help. Here are some search results. If you are a victim of domestic violence, there are key points listed at the top. Additional resources include links to self-help and links to clinics at Legal Aid. Follow the prompts. If I ask for more information, just answer to get the best help. Come try me out on our website at legalaidnp.org. I am here to help you find information and resources.
All right, so pretty cool, huh? What that does, though, it provides this kind of help and information 24/7, 365 to those people that need it. And it gets them directly to the answer. So as opposed to remember the before picture, because I always like to paint the before picture, you saw the after through Leah. But the before is that there would be a layperson, an ordinary person trying to get answers to their legal problem. And they might have to go through page upon page of information, really not knowing what they're looking for. And they might get sidetracked. They might go down a rabbit hole. They might find the information in different formats. It could be a PDF. It could be a video. It could be any number of things. And it's confusing, not quite sure which one to prioritize over the other. And what a knowledge assistant, which is what we call it, like Leah, what that accomplishes is that you get to put all of that information into one place, a knowledge base, and organize it exactly the way you want to provide the most valuable information to the end user, the person who's in need of a lawyer and legal information, and get that answer to them very quickly. So they don't have to be searching everywhere. You take the burden off their shoulders of having to find it, and you put the answers and the resources directly in their hands immediately. So it is quite a sea change in allowing people to get direct access to information. And so some of the efficiency gains that legal aid attorneys have experienced from using generative AI, 90% of them say it has increased their productivity. And just think of that. If it can increase their productivity for 90% of them, then it's that much more likely that they could take on a greater volume of cases, that many more people can be helped. And so literally, in this case, generative AI can act as a force multiplier to bridge that access to justice gap. 75% of those legal aid attorneys plan to continue to use a generative AI to help them. And so with greater efficiency, they can take on more cases and help more people. And also, even for pro bono attorneys, generative AI can act as a guide to help the volunteer attorneys get up to speed on practice areas they may be unfamiliar with and accelerate that training so that they can help more people. So just to emphasize that, generative AI chatbots in this case, they not only public facing, but also internal facing tools for volunteer attorneys to be able to get trained, get up to speed, and also be able to use it to answer frequently asked questions that their clients might have. So lastly, let's touch on some ethical and practical considerations. We need to remain vigilant. We need to double check the answers that are provided to ensure their accuracy. Also be cognizant of bias potentially that's creeping into the generative AI responses and output, and make sure that it reflects what we want it to reflect, and that it analyzes things in a more fair and balanced way. Lastly, we need to be vigilant about UPL, the unlawful practice of law, and that the chatbot is not crossing the line and giving individualized advice where it's saying you should do this or you should do that and making judgment calls of that nature. Of course, it could provide information. Of course, it could provide resources and next steps. But to advise someone about a particular course of action based upon the facts is still something that falls within an attorney's scope of what they should do. Data security and confidentiality, very important. As we have talked about, AI systems are sometimes training on data and they're cloud-based, and there's different security and confidentiality issues that are associated with that. But we've talked about before how to handle that, which is know your terms of service, know the limitations of the systems you use, ask questions. And we as lawyers, we ultimately have a responsibility to our rules of ethics to ensure that client information is handled in a responsible way. Finally, redacting sensitive information is a best practice. So either you redact the information within your system that you're using. So you want to choose an AI platform that allows for you to do that. Or it is now possible actually to filter sensitive data within a browser so that before the person actually submits it to the AI platform, the information is redacted within the person's browser. So the AI platform never receives it. Balancing human and machine. AI can excel at routine. It can excel at efficiency. But ultimately, people are looking for peace of mind, the confident guidance of an attorney, and accountability. We're fiduciaries. We're accountable to our clients. Sure, they look to us for the confidence of our experience and expertise, but also the fact that we stand behind our advice and our services. And that's why we carry malpractice insurance. But, the success of a marriage between human lawyers and artificial intelligence is that we find a way to responsibly thread the needle, to use AI where it's appropriate, but ultimately to have human supervision of the entirety of the representation. So with that, to recap, we talked a little bit about the current state of access to justice. There is a huge need, with 92% of people not receiving the representation that they need. Key challenges in the traditional models is that they're essentially built on a one-to-one representation model, where it's one client, one human attorney. And so what working with generative AI frees us up from is that traditional limiting model, so that instead of one-to-one, it could be one-to-many. And then it could help with many different routine tasks. it can help with intake, and as you saw with the example with Leah, it can run 24/7, 365 without having to sleep and still provide people with the answers they need and give them the direction that will provide them with a solution, hopefully, to their dilemma. Lastly, there's ethical and practical considerations that we still need to supervise these systems. We still need to ensure that the information is handled in a responsible way, ensuring privacy and security. So generative AI brings a spark of hope to bridging the access to justice gap, but we still need to be involved, remain vigilant, and work together to help provide access to justice to everyone. So thank you for staying with me for Rethinking Access to Justice and Pro Bono. See you next time.